Obviously, in the US and internationally, we've had a huge resurgence of concern about this topic. And I've ended up being involved in an interdisciplinary research project where I'm working with some data scientists and social scientists to think about how communities construct narratives around events of police violence and race. How does visual information end up getting translated into evidence or not? And for that reason, I thought it was important to kind of come back to this work and to develop it further, because I'm sort of trying to offer a humanistic perspective on how communities are constructing and contesting narratives around police violence and race. My focus is going to be on the US context. That's the context I'm in. In fact, I will offer some information very specific to my local context in Oklahoma in the central United States. Although obviously police violence is against communities of color is a global problem and not just a US problem. So I want to start by offering a land acknowledgement, since I am on Indigenous lands. Before the University of Oklahoma, which is my affiliation, was established, the land on which the university now sits, and from which I am speaking because I also reside on this land, I'm at home, was the traditional home of the Caddo Nation and the Wichita and affiliated tribes. This land also served as a hunting ground, trade exchange point, and migration route for the Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, and Osage nations. Today, 39 tribal nations reside in the state of Oklahoma as a result of settler and colonial policies that were designed to assimilate Native people. I acknowledge and honor the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to this land. I also want to acknowledge that I'm speaking about a topic, police killings and related forms of brutality, that is deeply traumatizing to communities of color. I'm giving this talk in the wake of many other recent acts of racialized violence, including a racialized, misogynist mass murder that targeted Asian-descended women, and killings of Latino teen Adam Toledo and Black teen Ma'Khia Bryant by police. Philosophy tends to take place in disproportionately white spaces, where it's, maybe I'll stop sharing for a minute. It's not really necessary. I'll come back to the slides in a minute. Philosophy tends to take place in disproportionately white spaces, where it's easy to slip into a mode of thinking about grave forms of social injustice that is detached or clinical. Philosophy has a history and a tendency of treating personal engagement and emotional response as compromising rather than contributing to sound inquiry. For people of color who find themselves present in philosophical spaces where situations that profoundly affect their communities are either neglected entirely or subjected to this sort of detachment, the experience can be profoundly alienating. So I want to acknowledge that this is a painful topic, and it's especially painful for communities that have been targeted and for people who live every day, knowing that they themselves and the people they love may be targeted just for driving, just for walking, just for being visible in the world. I want to acknowledge that emotional responses to this topic are appropriate and that emotions can be a source of knowledge about injustice. My inquiry today is motivated by a key question. What happens when we're confronted with video of brutality against a person of color by police? How do such videos function or fail to function as evidence? This is an epistemic question, but it connects to aesthetics insofar as aesthetics has tools for thinking about interpretation and construction of narratives in relation to photographic media. Now, before I turn to discussing racialized police violence from an aesthetic perspective, I want to establish a baseline of shared information. Police in the US kill people at extraordinarily high rates as compared to other wealthy nations. We're really off the charts. And there are enormous differentials, especially in some municipalities, in the rates at which they kill people by race. I live in the Oklahoma City metro area. Oklahoma City police are number 2 in the US for the rate at which they kill people. And they kill Black people at 5.5 times the rate relative to their share of the population at which they kill white people. Oklahoma City police officers alone kill Black men at a rate that is higher than the US national murder rate. Though the numbers are smaller and data are less systematically available, Indigenous people, particularly women, also experience very high rates of police killing nationally. And Oklahoma City is the #2 city in the nation for number of Native Americans killed by police over the past 8 years. Mapping police violence, which is the largest systematic data collection on this effort, finds that rates of violent crime in a city have no effect on the rate at which the police department kills people. So it's not just a matter of the city being more violent and more people being killed in the city. That's not what explains the high rates of violence. In addition, Black and brown people killed by police are significantly less likely to be armed or to have been engaging in any kind of aggressive activity when they're killed. So mapping police violence finds that 48% of unarmed people killed by the 100 largest city police departments in the US were Black. These police departments killed unarmed Black people at a rate 4 times higher than unarmed white people. In addition, data collection by the Washington Post suggests that there has been no decline in police killings since 2015. So they've just got a trajectory every single year. And you're seeing you can see in the 2021 line, just a little blip after the Derek Chauvin verdict. That was a police officer who killed George Floyd. When he was convicted, there was a slight dip, but you can see the trajectory is already on its upward turn again. So despite a massive national and international uprising, there's been no effect on how often police kill people in the US. So I'll stop sharing again for a minute. There are many structural elements that explain why officers are rarely held accountable for such killings, why events like the conviction of Officer Derek Chauvin, who killed George Floyd, are so extraordinarily rare. I want to look at a particular strand. How do audiences, including juries, interpret visual information about these events? How do we incorporate visual information into narrative understandings of what happened? When does the visual information incorporated into narrative function as evidence, and what is it evidence of? Well before George Floyd was killed in 2020, many moving images of racialized police violence had widely circulated. Images of Eric Garner being killed by a chokehold as caught by a cell phone. Images of John Crawford III being killed in a Walmart as caught by in-store surveillance cameras. Images of 12-year-old Tamir Rice being killed in a public park as caught by an outdoor surveillance camera. Images of Walter Scott being shot in the back as caught by a cell phone. There have also been many moving images of police violence against Black women, though these have garnered less attention. Alicia Thomas being kicked multiple times before dying in the back of a police cruiser. Professor Ursula Orr being thrown to the ground by Arizona State University campus police after being stopped for jaywalking. Michelle Cooks being wrestled to the ground while 8 months pregnant because she was verifying her obligation to identify herself. And 14-year-old Dejaria Becton, clad in a bikini because she had been attending a pool party, being dragged by her hair, thrown to the ground, and kneed in the back. Many people have expressed hope that with the advent of widespread technology to capture moving images, we'll finally be in a position to acknowledge and address the systemic problem with racialized police violence. The international uprising that followed release of the video of the killing of George Floyd and the recent conviction of the officer who killed him might seem to support this story. But I want to suggest that the situation is more complicated. Videos of racialized police violence do not function straightforwardly as evidence of injustice. And this is part of the explanation of why, despite a years-long movement, we have so far seen little concrete change. I'm not the first person to express skepticism about the sufficiency of video evidence, but I want to connect this skepticism to some specifically aesthetic phenomena having to do with how we interpret images, especially photographic images. I want to make clear before I continue that we will not watch any moving images of people being killed during this presentation. We will see some stills from longer moving images. We will also see one moving image of an encounter which, while troubling, does not involve any physical violence. But first, let's consider how we look at images. In 1966, Paul Ziff described the fact that different images call for different forms of engagement. He called these acts of inspection. To contemplate a painting is to perform one act of inspection. To scan it is to perform another. To study, observe, survey, inspect, examine, scrutinize, and so forth are still other acts of inspection. I survey a Tintoretto while I scan a Bosch. Thus, I step back to look at the Tintoretto, up to look at the Bosch. Different actions are involved. Do you drink brandy the way that you drink beer? In the US, I like to insert tequila in place of brandy. I don't think anyone here knows what brandy is. I don't know if it's different over there. An act of inspection involves a certain way of looking at the image, a particular manner of seeking out information, and regarding certain levels and kinds of detail is highly relevant in some cases and less relevant in others. We engage in different acts of inspection in relation to the Tintoretto and Bosch images because they have different aesthetic affordances, and we're attempting to access those. So many of the affordances of a Tintoretto, even a finely detailed one such as the enormous paradise, are large scale and formal. So we step back to appreciate the composition as a whole. The Bosch, on the other hand, offers us much more at the level of small local detail. And there I've just blown up one tiny section of the image so that you can see the convex mirror that seems to be on some green creature's posterior. Sometimes we're looking for aesthetic affordances. Other times we're looking for information, often using an act of inspection we have been trained to perform. A doctor making a diagnosis will perform a very specific act of inspection in regarding an X-ray. She will scan it, often in search of a very specific information from a certain region of the image. I suggest that there's a particular act of inspection that plays a critical role in relation to recent documentary images of police violence. This act of inspection is scrutiny of the body and its behavior for a justification of violence against it. We're sometimes invited by authorities to engage in such acts of inspection. In the video of the shooting death of 12-year-old Tamir Rice, a red circle was drawn and a caption added to help us detect the information. Oops, sorry, things went a little awry there. To help us detect the information that the police department felt was so crucial in justifying its officers' action. So this is a still that has been altered, annotated by the authorities. And what they're trying to show us is that Tamir's hand moved downward, or as the caption puts it, to waistband. That information is supposed to explain why the officers who pulled up very close to him felt so threatened that one of them fired fatal rounds at him within 2 seconds of their arrival. And the 911 call that reported Tamir being in the park had said that the gun was probably fake, and indeed it was. It was a BB gun, but Tamir was nonetheless killed at the age of 12, very soon after the police arrived. In the video of the chokehold that killed Eric Garner, there's a brief moment during which Mr. Garner is often said to have resisted arrest. This resistance is constituted by the fact that Mr. Garner, who had been actively gesticulating with his hands while speaking to the officers, moved his arm after one officer pulled it to his side, presumably to handcuff him for the crime of selling individual cigarettes for 75 cents each, because that is the crime for which Mr. Garner was being contacted by the police. Here you see his right arm at his side. Here, you see it out again. Both of these stills were taken at 37 seconds into the video. So this is a fraction of a second movement that we're talking about. And you can see Mr. Garner isn't aggressive and he's not showing any signs of fleeing. By 38 seconds, the very next second, a moment I will not show, Mr. Garner was in the chokehold that killed him. The fact that he moved his arm is the justifying evidence that explains the violence against him. It serves as such justifying evidence by way of an act of naming it as resisting arrest. This despite the fact that he shows no signs of aggression or intent to flee. I'm informed here by a point made by Susan Sontag in her discussion of photography in the early 70s. There can be no evidence, photographic or otherwise, of an event until the event itself has been named and characterized. There are acts of naming that have preceded our encounters with these images. Resisting arrest, reaching to the waistband, and more generally, failure to comply have been named. And they've been given a very broad characterization that encompasses relatively minimal bodily movements. Police brutality, too, has been named and given a specific, oops, I think I skipped a slide. So anyway, resisting arrest, reaching to the waistband, failure to comply, very broadly characterized. You can identify one of these with a minimal bodily movement, but police brutality also has been named, and its naming involves a negative characterization. In order for police brutality to be present, there must be the absence of any possible justification for physical contact. And often in the way these narratives are constructed, if there's any justification for physical contact at all, there's no requirement of proportionality. The police contact is disqualified as an act of brutality. After all, Eric Garner was resisting arrest, so the physical contact with him was justified, and the charge of brutality ends up being defeated. Viewing of these images then becomes a sort of Where's Waldo exercise in seeking out that minimal movement that nullifies a finding of police brutality. We thus have the logic whereby a jury found in 1992, when I was in college on a day that I remember vividly, that no brutality had been committed against the prone and virtually incapacitated Rodney King, since he was expected to remain perfectly motionless rather than attempting to elude the 56 baton blows that battered and broke his body. And the logic by which a grand jury in 2014 failed even to indict the officer who killed Eric Garner with a chokehold that is banned by NYPD procedure. Several years ago, the then police chief of Norman, Oklahoma, which is the city I live in, sent a video to a group of people he knew to be concerned about the problem of racialized police violence. The video shows 3 teenage boys being stopped by an officer after a call came in that one of them was carrying a gun. Before I show a few seconds of the video, I want to note that it shows a tense scene, but there's no physical violence. So here you're going to see an officer telling us what to look for. You're going to see some footage of this officer pulling up to confront these 3 teenage boys, and there's another officer off screen who's narrating the events.
As he drives up, look at the kid in the gray right of your screen.
Looks back, sees the officer. What was that move at his waistband? But that's what law enforcement we call a furtive gesture, and it's highly concerning, particularly given the comments on this call.
So this officer is telling you to look for a furtive gesture. So let's watch it again, and let's see if we can see it.
As he drives up, look at the kid in the gray right of your screen.
Looks back, sees the officer. What was that move at his waistband? But that's what law enforcement we call a furtive gesture, and it's highly concerning, particularly given the comments on this call.
So certainly there was a movement of an arm. There are 3 teenagers. They've just noticed that a police car is pulling up, and they are concerned and they're looking, and one of them moved his hand. The naming of that movement as a furtive gesture, which makes the whole situation suspicious and frames those children as dangerous, that's the kind of active naming that I'm talking about. Even if no such minimal movement is found, other mechanisms are available to inoculate officers from charges of police brutality. We're told that the image shows only one angle on the events, or that the view is obstructed, or that there's something happening that the police can see or know, and we, for some reason, cannot. There's always a narrative on offer that is presented as overriding the visual evidence of absence of threat. Consider the case of John Crawford III, a 22-year-old parent of 2 young children. Crawford was shopping in a Walmart and chatting on his cell phone when he picked up a product from the shelf. A product that was being sold in that store was a BB gun. As surveillance footage shows, he carried the product casually at his side for several minutes while continuing to stroll through the store and talk on the phone. He's holding his cell phone in his right hand. At one point, he stopped walking and turned to face an aisle of products with the BB gun still held casually at his side, not aimed at anyone or anything. He was still talking on the phone. And soon after, you see in the surveillance footage that his body crumples to the ground after he is fatally shot by a police officer. Though Crawford was carrying only a BB gun sold in that very store and was in an open carry state, that is, a state where he had a legal right to carry an unconcealed firearm without a license, the officers involved in killing him were not even indicted, which means that they weren't even preliminarily charged with any crime. Everything was completely dismissed without even a full kind of trial or investigation. The official statement given by Sean Williams, the officer who fatally shot Crawford, states the following: Sergeant Darko repeatedly yelled, "Drop the weapon." The black male did not drop the rifle. After repeated commands to drop the weapon, the male turned towards us in an aggressive manner with the rifle in hand. At that time, the black male was in a position where he could shoot me or Sergeant Darko. I felt at that moment that my life was in immediate danger, that Sergeant Darko's life was in immediate danger, and that the lives of all the families, children, and customers were in immediate danger. I then fired 2 rounds at the suspect. We will not watch the video here, but as Michael Wright, the Crawford family's attorney, accurately observed, it is difficult to understand how Officer Williams believed anyone was in immediate danger, as Mr. Crawford was standing in the aisle alone and talking on his cell phone. Video of the shooting indicates that a command was given only once and that Crawford was shot within a second. It also strongly suggests that Crawford did not hear the command or recognize that he was being addressed. He falls to the ground without even turning his head to orient toward the sound, much less turning toward the officers in an aggressive manner. However, a statement from the Beaver Creek City Attorney's Office, released after the grand jury failed to indict, said, based on the information the responding officers had and Mr. Crawford's failure to comply with the responding officer's orders, the officers did what they were trained to do to protect the public. So when video evidence appears to show clearly that a person was shot dead despite doing nothing wrong, posing no threat, and receiving no intelligible command, officials continue to claim that there was failure to comply. We see again an asymmetry that is tied to the logic of these concepts. Video can provide sufficient evidence that an officer's violent actions were justified due to threat or failure to comply. But it cannot provide sufficient evidence that the officer's actions were unjustified, because there's always a story to be told about threat that is present, yet not visible in the frame. What then are we looking for when we look at these images? In his famous essay of The Standard of Taste, written in 1757, David Hume spoke of what it is to be a good judge of art. Good judges have delicacy of taste, and this means being able to detect the relevant qualities of an image, even when they're present in very small quantities and mixed with other things, like being able to detect just a hint of cumin in a dish. Where the organs are so fine as to allow nothing to escape them, and at the same time so exact as to perceive every ingredient in the composition, this we call delicacy of taste. If the same qualities in a continued composition and in a smaller degree affect not the organs, we exclude the person from all pretensions to this delicacy. Non-experts, Hume implies, will often be missing something in their encounters with images. They may detect and respond to an image's coarse-grained features, but fail to detect the fine-grained features that contribute crucially to its value. Something very similar is at play in relation to the acts of inspection that we commit on these moving images. We may scrutinize them and fail to detect any modicum of resisting arrest or furtive movements or failure to comply or threat. But then the response is that we, as lay members of the public, are not qualified lookers. Indeed, the very fact that we haven't detected these qualities is evidence of our incompetence. Should we protest, we'll be told that exculpatory evidence is present, but it's just outside the frame of whatever the video captures. I've said nothing about the ways in which race affects the performance of and the invitation to perform this act of inspection. Of course, the official narrative is that race plays no role. Concepts like resisting arrest, furtive movements, and reaching to the waistband are allegedly race neutral. This official narrative is belied by countless studies showing that perceptions, judgments, and evaluations are affected by race at every turn, with Black bodies more likely to be viewed as suspicious, dangerous, and aggressive, and Black people disproportionately punished due to these racialized perceptions. As a number of commentators have pointed out, recent narratives of police violence against Black people often have employed elements of a trope involving, in filmmaker Spike Lee's words, the magical, mystical Negro. The framing of Black people as superhuman conditions the idea that they're less susceptible to bodily harm and that more force is required to restrain them. This trope is realized in countless narratives, both fictional and non-fictional, and elements of it are found in everyday beliefs about how much pain Black people experience as compared to whites, and in the tendency of doctors to undertreat pain and other medical conditions in Black patients. As Jamel Bowie and Sheena Howard have argued, the trope is present in former police officer Darren Wilson's narrative about why he had to kill Michael Brown, a teenager in Ferguson, Missouri. Wilson said that when holding Brown's arm, "I felt like a 5-year-old holding onto Hulk Hogan. That's just how big he felt and how small I felt just from grasping his arm." He described Brown as looking like a demon and said that he feared a punch from Brown might be fatal. Darren Wilson, the officer, was 28 years old, 6'4", and weighed 210 pounds. Michael Brown was 18 years old, 6'5", and weighed 289. There was a size difference, yes, but hardly on the order of a 5-year-old versus Hulk Hogan. John Crawford III was executed on sight because his mere presence with what was thought to be a rifle, though it was not raised or aimed, posed an immediate danger to police officers whose weapons were trained upon Crawford and to families who were not in the immediate vicinity. It does sound like magic, doesn't it? And as many have pointed out, white people, even when they're manifestly heavily armed and have their hands on their weapons, somehow don't inspire such a quick draw. This is a picture from a Confederate rally in the state of Georgia in 2015. The magical Negro trope is available to police because it's available to all of us. It's a thread that has been running through white supremacy for hundreds of years. The claim that Black people suffer less than whites was one of the justifying tenets of slavery, and the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche stated it in a perniciously racist passage on the genealogy of morals 150 years ago. This is perhaps a relevant moment to note the similarly pernicious racism of philosophical pillars like David Hume and Immanuel Kant. Studies show that white people today still see Black bodies as less susceptible to pain and more likely to have superhuman powers than white bodies. Our viewing of moving images of police violence is conditioned by the same racialized modes of perception that we exhibit in everyday life. The interpretive lens through which we grasp what's happening in the image is already a racialized one. But we must also attend to the way in which our viewing of these images is not only informed by, but may in fact deepen these racialized tendencies of perception. The principal genre of image that has entered the public discourse as relevant to the problem of racialized police violence is the image of the Black body in confrontation with police. And thus the act of inspection that has been prescribed and adopted for these images winds up being a racialized one, that of scrutinizing the Black body for furtive movements and non-compliance and signs of resisting. This is simply a reiteration of the very act of inspection that leads to racially disproportionate levels of violence in the first place. It's one that white supremacist culture trains people to commit. As Black philosopher George Yancey describes the click, click, click of car door locks as he walks by. And he discusses the fact that the Black male body is always already a weapon, a claim eerily confirmed by commentator Ben Stein when he said that 18-year-old Michael Brown, who possessed no weapon, was not unarmed, but instead armed with his big, scary body. When we search these videos for signs that the Black body is threatening, we're training ourselves, becoming attuned to ever more subtle signs of threat, especially when this looking is conditioned by official acts of naming that train us to see threat everywhere. We may watch the videos again and again, eventually finding that yes, there is something to see here, and we are finally competent, sensitive enough to see it. I want to connect this discussion back to one other point made by Susan Sontag, and I forgot to put the slide in that has this quote in it, but Sontag says, "Through photographs, the world becomes a series of unrelated, freestanding particles, and history, past and present, a set of anecdotes and faits divers, scattered facts. It's a view of the world which denies interconnectedness, continuity, but which confers on each moment the character of a mystery." So once a video becomes available, the act of focusing on the image, scrutinizing it for relevant evidence, swamps attention to other factors. It contributes to an already prevalent tendency to ignore history and context and focus only on what happened in the course of a few moments. The many factors that led to those few seconds, everything that happened before the camera was turned on, becomes unknowable and thus irrelevant. This moment is treated as an atom, isolated from all others, in which a snap judgment had to be made. Oops. Oh, there's our Confederate friend again. Ursula Orr, a Black woman who's a professor at Arizona State University, was stopped by campus police for jaywalking, which means sort of illegally crossing the street. I don't know if you all use the same term. Let's pause for a moment to note how remarkable this fact is. I've been jaywalking, crossing at illegal spots on predominantly white college campuses for over 30 years, and I've never been contacted by police or seen anyone else contacted for this pervasive behavior. Orr, too, was well aware from her many years on college campuses that it is not normal for anyone, especially a faculty member, to be stopped for jaywalking. As she says to the officer captured by his dash cam, "I never once saw a single solitary individual get pulled over by a cop for walking across a street in a campus location." Moreover, her scholarship provided her with context for this encounter. She won an award in 2011 for her doctoral dissertation at Penn State University. And the award citation notes, that her work pays particular attention to the spaces where legal code and social practice converge, how such convergences contribute to a racialized definition of American citizenship, and the ways in which visual and material culture help to sustain this definition. And so, on experiencing herself caught up in precisely the racialized convergence of legal code and social practice that is the subject of her scholarship, when the officer approached her and asked condescendingly, "Are you aware that this is a street?" she did not immediately assume a meek and compliant demeanor. Oops. As the video shows, she continually questions the officer's disrespectful manner and points out that many other people have been engaging in exactly the same behavior without police contact, because there was actually some kind of a construction thing that she was crossing the street to avoid. The sidewalk was blocked by construction, so lots of people were crossing right where she crossed. When she continues to speak, rather than producing ID as the officer has requested, he decides to handcuff her. When she fails to position her hands to the officer's satisfaction, he tells her, "I'm going to slam you on this car," and eventually throws her to the ground. Discussions of this incident tend to center on the dash cam audio and video, with the typical conclusion being that Orr failed to comply and resisted arrest. What the image doesn't show is how Orr came to be contacted by police for a behavior that thousands of students, faculty, and staff commit every day. It doesn't show us how a pattern of policing continually puts people of color in the line of fire. It doesn't show us that hundreds of cities in the US have majority Black populations, but employ very few Black officers. It doesn't show us how many cities in the US raise revenue by targeting minority residents for police interventions. The city of Ferguson, Missouri, its #2 source of municipal revenue was court fines and fees levied on its own citizens, and people of color were disproportionately targeted. It doesn't show us how the basic well-being of people of color, their right to go about their business without being randomly detained, has been sacrificed. Focus on the image obscures for us the systematic factors that lead to the accrual of these images. Now, I'm not arguing that images have no role to play in response to systemic injustice. The video of the killing of George Floyd played a critical role in galvanizing an international movement in 2020 and has now led to the conviction of an officer for murder, an event that remains vanishingly rare. But this video is different from many others in the totalizing force with which Floyd was held completely passive, his body making no movements that could be interpreted as resisting or posing a threat. The video, up close and clear with audio, the presence of multiple observers complicating any attempt to spin a narrative about the insufficiency of the video to show what was really happening. This video meets the nearly impossible standard of manifesting an absence, the absence of any physical movement that is subject to naming or interpretation in a way that would justify the officer's lethal force. But if this is what's required to hold an officer accountable, and it remains to be seen whether the officer will in fact be held accountable through the courts, he's announced an intent to appeal, This is an unacceptable standard. A person shouldn't have to be completely motionless to deactivate the presumption that extreme or lethal police force is justified. In addition, the situation we saw last summer, where about 20 million people were believed to have participated in protests in over 2,000 US cities, large and small, has significantly eroded. There's been a significant decline in the number of people who express support for the Black Lives Matter movement, and a significant rebound in trust in the police, despite the fact that, as I mentioned earlier, the rate of police killings hasn't changed. Hegemonic narratives, according to which our society is largely just, racist police are just a few bad apples, and aggressive policing is needed to maintain order and safety, readily re-entrench themselves. Understanding this phenomenon is to great extent an empirical project. And I've just started, as I mentioned, working with an interdisciplinary team to look at the kinds of narratives that people are collectively constructing about these events on social media, and understanding which narratives and which kind of social media communication strategies are most successful in moving public support towards systemic change in policing and accountability. But I want to offer some hypotheses about both about the re-entrenchment of hegemonic narratives and about possible solutions. The re-entrenchment seems to occur through a number of mechanisms. One, described by Sontag, is that images of a horror new to the viewer shock at first, but eventually anesthetize. The very accrual of images that is used by activists to argue that there's a widespread systemic problem can have the paradoxical effect of making that very problem seem pervasive, inevitable, and thus pointless to resist, becoming a mere curiosity for white viewers, even while traumatizing members of targeted communities. A second mechanism is the active construction of counter-narratives, according to which protesters are the real problem. Just a handful of vivid images facilitate a renaming of protests, regardless of their largely peaceful character, as rioting and looting. And that expression occurs frequently in the media and in public social media discussions of protests. Attempting to explain any rioting and looting that has in fact occurred, because occasionally it does happen, attempting to explain it as understandable expression of a community's outrage seems to just even more deeply entrench the perception that the resistance movement is inherently violent, aimless, and unruly. Strategic undermining of the resistance movement is then used to construct its participants as biased, as we've seen just in the past few days in relation to a Black juror in the jury that convicted Derek Chauvin, who was later seen to have participated in the March on Washington wearing a Black Lives Matter t-shirt. An NBC News headline asks, "Is it grounds for appeal?" And the Washington Post states that experts say it raises questions of impartiality. So mere participation in a Black Lives Matter rally in Washington is construed as evidence of bias, that this juror should not have been impaneled to assess the justifiability of a police officer's actions. Now, I've just described two things that ought to be in tension with each other. The effect of the accrual of images of injustice is to make that injustice appear real and pervasive, you would think. And this should strengthen rather than undermine perceptions of the legitimacy of protest. But the combined effect of these mechanisms seems to be to sow a sort of chaos and confusion that leads to forgetting. There's so much of this happening, and yet the protests are unjustified. A fog descends over the crisp understanding many had last summer about the fact that extrajudicial killings of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people are a longstanding national emergency in the US. What makes white people, especially middle-class white people without identities that make them vulnerable to being targeted by police, so susceptible to such forgetting? Charles Mills and other scholars of white ignorance discuss racialized motivated cognition. White comfort is maintained through a belief that the world is fundamentally just, that middle-class white people deserve the safety they tend to enjoy, and that the threat to people of color is exaggerated. This stance has the added benefit of convenience. If the problem is exaggerated, one is justified in not putting in too much effort to resisting it. The fog sets in and hegemonic narratives are reinstalled in the minds of white people then, because these narratives are familiar, comfortable, and convenient. This is a crucial area where epistemology and aesthetics intersect. Our systems of belief and fundamental orientation to the world are products, in considerable part, of what kinds of narratives we're comfortable relaxing into, wrapping around ourselves like an insulating blanket. When the world continually pummels you by disproportionately targeting you and those who look like you for violence, your ability to sink into a comforting narrative is limited. You're jarred out of narratives of ignorance about the structure of your world. And this painful experience is epistemically salutary. It tends to result in more accurate understandings, as many scholars of race and epistemology have observed. Those with the ability to protect themselves, on the other hand, are simply motivated to build ever thicker insulating blankets, obscuring their view of and vulnerability to realities that harm others. This leaves us with a conundrum that is at once aesthetic, epistemic, ethical, and political. If the support of people outside targeted communities is needed to implement effective reforms, which seems from a practical perspective to be true in many contexts, how do we address the fact that these people tend to be drawn back to the cozy blanket of ignorance? Or to put it bluntly, how should we respond to the fact that white people tend to be so disappointing? And I don't accept myself. At times I wake up and see these same fluctuations in my own level of commitment and attention, the same fog of ignorance and forgetting settling in. There are a few possible strategies. One is the construction of compelling narratives that have the power to captivate attention and deeply entrench new forms of resistant understanding. If this is right, aesthetic excellence may play a role in the cultivation of more adequate ethical and epistemic orientations toward the world. A second and complementary strategy involving aesthetic innovation and proliferation is the adoption of a practice of re-articulating resistant narratives on many occasions and in new forms. This is a collective project to be adopted by creators of narrative, as well as by those who control publication venues, so that narratives are presented through podcasts, print media, and popular arts, as well as through social media and other forms of public and private discourse. A worry about these strategies, given the conundrum of white apathy that motivated thinking about them, is that they will generate particular kinds of narratives that keep white audiences engaged at the expense of communities of color. Narratives that titillate white audiences by presenting racialized police violence as exotic or fascinating, or narratives that keep them comfortable enough to stay engaged by glossing over complexities. The proliferation of such narratives may traumatize communities of color by erasing some aspects of their experience while rendering others painfully vivid. In response to such concerns, is it necessary to cultivate separate narrative pathways, one for white people and one for people of color? The answer may, to some extent, be yes. There are numerous models of parallel discourse where different communities are addressed differently. My colleague Carlos Hill, in his work on lynching, discusses two different categories of narrative that Black communities in the US constructed. Victimization narratives, which were designed to secure the awareness of whites that the Black community is subject to acute injustice in the form of lynching, and what he calls consoling narratives directed within the Black community, designed to reinstill a sense of agency in the face of injustice by emphasizing victims' resistance and heroism. Different narratives directed toward different audiences with different functions. Showing Up for Racial Justice, or SURJ, is an organization that describes its mission as moving white people to act as part of a multiracial majority for justice with passion and accountability. SURJ involves white activists for racial justice meeting other white people where they are, having discussions that are necessary for those new to an understanding of racial justice that would be remedial and frustrating for many people of color. So you can imagine the explanation of why All Lives Matter is not an appropriate rejoinder to Black Lives Matter being conducted over and over again as new people arrive, wondering why it's necessary to assert specifically that Black Lives Matter. Ultimately, though, our best hope may be for narratives that can perform multiple functions for multiple communities. I think, for example, of the recent police killing of 16-year-old Ma'Khia Bryant in Columbus, Ohio, which happened within a few minutes of the reading of the guilty verdict against Derek Chauvin. Ma'Khia had a knife. She was involved in a fight, and there was a risk that she would stab another girl when she was shot. So there's an easy story to tell, and it's been told often. Some told it by saying that the police officer who shot Micaiah was protecting the other girl, may have even saved her life. But there's a more complex story to tell about what would have happened if the police hadn't been there at all. A story about how high school teachers and group home staff have disarmed teenagers with knives many a time. A story about other strategies you would try if you didn't have a gun in your holster or already in your hand. And there's a broader and deeper story about the preciousness of Micaiah's life, about how being in a fight, even with a knife in your hand, even as an aggressor in that moment, shouldn't make you expendable. I don't know whether there are narratives of this kind that can address communities with fundamentally different experiences, that can capture Micaiah's humanity for people disposed to accept the easy story about her death, even while offering something for people for whom that humanity is readily visible. If such narratives are achievable, though, it is perhaps through aesthetic excellence, the sort of excellence that might be found in great works of tragedy. I think here I'd just like to stop and have some discussion with you all.